Hey guys, in this video I'm going to go over the most commonly missed questions on the unit 4 test. So pay close attention here. I go over these questions by looking at the data from the test and looking at percentages of students who get questions right and wrong, and these were the questions that the lowest percent of students got correct. So hopefully this will help you on the retake, and then just like normal at the end of this video you will get the password to retake the Unit 4 test in biology. So here we go, starting off. In which two structures of a flowering plant will you find haploid cells? Okay, so first thing we need to know is the definition of haploid and diploid cells. And remember, diploid, we can say versus haploid. And I remember these because diploid has the prefix di, which means 2. So that's 2n. Haploid, H, and we have half, so it's half the amount of a diploid, so it's just n. All right, and remember, these are the number of chromosomes in the cells of that part of the plant. So we'd say a diploid cell has 2 of each chromosome. N is like chromosomes. N's like 1 chromosome. So if we have 2n, we have 2 of each chromosome. Haploid is just n, and so it only has 1 of each chromosome in a haploid cell. And so, remember, haploid cells with only 1 of each chromosome in humans are like our sex cells, which are the sperm and the egg cells, and the rest of our body in humans are diploid. We have, remember, 2 of each chromosome. And so this is saying which structures in the flowering plant will you find haploid cells? And so haploid cells are the sex cells of a plant, which, remember, our pollen is like the male gamete, is like the sperm for plants. So we'll put male. And then we have the egg still, which is the female gamete in plants. Right, and so now all we have to do is we have to, okay, we know pollen is the male gamete, that's haploid, and egg cells are the female gamete, the female sex cells, and that's also haploid, so we need to know where those are at in our plant diagram here. And we can look, and this is kind of, I don't really like this diagram that much, but we can see here, it's definitely not D, D is a petal, right? Now we need to decide between, and then A, I think clearly A are the egg cells. Right, the egg cell, this is the ovule, the ovary, which contain the egg cells. So that's one of the answers, and we need 2. So it's A and what? And then it's between B and C, and this is a little bit hard to see here, but you can see B, there's 4 of them. There's these little things shooting up. There's a couple over here too. And then C is this top portion here on the middle, thicker stalk. And so if you remember, pollen is produced on the filaments, on the anthers. And the anthers are those little things that surround the central stigma. So B is pointing to the anthers. Oops. C is pointing to the stigma. And hopefully we remember that pollen is produced on the anthers. And so the answer for this question is A and B. Right, now don't just memorize that, obviously. Make sure you look at your diagram. The numbers could be switched depending on what test you have, but you want the one that's pointing to the eggs, and I think that one's pretty clear for us, and the one that's pointing to the anthers, which are these little kind of stalks with the yellow bulb on the end surrounding this thicker, bigger middle stalk. And so it's the little ones around the outside that have the anthers, and that's where the pollen is produced, and that's the male gamete. Okay, so now there's another question on this diagram. Which structure shows where pollen grains develop? And lo and behold, we've just talked about that, actually. And remember, pollen is developed on the anther. And so the answer to this one, it would be, well, for this one it would be B, which is the anther. All right. What does stage 1 of these examples of these sarcomeres represent? And then we'll go into when a muscle contracts, what happens. So first, what does stage 1 represent? You get a picture and there's two stages here, stage 1 and stage 2, and you're given the choices are a muscle that is fully contracted, a muscle that is rotating, and a muscle that is fully at rest. And so I think everyone knows these are not muscles rotating. Muscles do not rotate. And so the question for stage 1 really is this the muscle that is fully contracted or a muscle that is at rest? And so looking at stage 1, comparing it to stage 2, we can see these these smaller filaments here, smaller kind of strands, the actin. Remember, that's the actin, and then this bigger, thicker one in the middle is the myosin. The actin in stage 1, they're not overlapping at all. And we notice in stage 2, they get pulled a lot closer together, so they are overlapping. And remember, when a muscle contracts, it gets shorter. So if a muscle is fully contracted, it's a lot shorter than when it's at rest. And that's how you can tell if a muscle is relaxed or contracted. The relaxed muscle will be longer, and the contracted muscle will be shorter. The relaxed muscle, these actins, will not be overlapped, and in a contracted muscle, they will be overlapped. And you can see here, if you just look, you can see this sarcomere is much longer than stage 2. And so stage 2 is contracted. Remember, contracted means shortened. So stage 2 is contracted, and stage 1 must be fully at rest. So it would be stage 1 represent. Stage 1 is at rest because the actin is not overlapped, and the sarcomere here is much longer. Now, another question on your exam asks, when a muscle contracts, what actually happens? And you get a couple of choices. Calcium combines with ATP, actin produces myosin, myosin heads attach, or calcium produces contractions. And the answers were kind of split between two choices. People either thought that calcium combines with ATP to produce sarcomeres, or they thought that myosin heads attach to and pull on a series of actin binding sites. And for a muscle to contract, remember, it's the myosin heads, these little things right here, where they're like little ratchets, they attach to the actin filament, and then they kind of ratchet or they pull the actin filaments closer together. Right, so from both sides they're doing this, and then if we pull those actin filaments closer together, we can see this is what happens, right? They were pulled much closer together and now they overlapped. And so when a muscle contracts, what happens? Well, remember those myosin heads, they attach to the actin, and then they pull on the actin, make it look like a little ratchet motion, and they pull the actin molecules closer together, and then here in stage 2 we have contraction. Okay. Going on, which statement best describes the life cycle of plants such as ferns? And remember, there's actually a fairly complicated life cycle for a lot of plants, and you guys do not need to know that very complicated life cycle. Perhaps in college you will. But for us, you need to know, and you can see these were the answer choices here on one of the questions, that it's a two-part life cycle, and they spend part of their life in a diploid phase and part in a haploid phase. And you can see that over here, right? Half of the life of the plant is spent in the haploid stage, half is spent in the diploid stage. So your other options, plants have a single life cycle and are entirely diploid. That is not the case. Remember, it's split between haploid and diploid. Plants have a single life cycle that's all haploid. Nope, we just talked about that. And then plants have a different number of phases in their life cycle. And generally, for our purposes, remember, we're learning that they spend part of their life in diploid and part of their life in haploid. Moving on to the next question here. Last one we'll go over. What is an example of asexual reproduction in plants? And remember, asexual reproduction means that something can reproduce itself. It does not need a partner. It does not need another organism's genetic material to produce. It's basically creating a clone. It just uses its own genetic information and it creates a new organism. And then we have some choices here that what would be asexual reproduction. And the answer, you can see, hopefully, is budding. Now let's look at why. So remember, budding is if we have a plant here. This is, I don't know what kind of plant this is, but it's something. Budding is when there's a little bud, and I know when we think of buds, we think of like buds on trees with leaves coming out, and that is a bud, but this is referring to different kinds of budding, a different kind of a bud. In this bud, there would be a little outgrowth of a plant from this plant, and then this outgrowth here would fall off eventually. So here it is, it's now fallen off, and then eventually that would grow into a whole new plant, a whole new adult organism, just like the one that it fell off. And these two would be genetically identical. They would have the same genes, because remember, there was not another organism to combine genes with. Like in humans, we have the sperm cell from the father and the egg cell from the mother, and the genes get combined, and so their offspring, like you guys, you have genetics from both your mother and your father. Budding, there is none. There's only one parent, and so all the genes for the parent and the offspring are the same. And that's what budding is. So that's why that's asexual reproduction. Remember, asexual is with one partner. It's without sex. It's just one parent. These other options, we have producing pollen. So remember, that's not asexual reproduction. Remember, pollen is actually the male gamete, and it combines with another plant's egg to make a new plant, to make a seed, actually. And so that's why this last one here, producing seeds, is not asexual reproduction, because to produce a seed, the pollen combines with the egg, and then that forms a seed, so that is sexual reproduction, right? We have genetic material from one plant and genetic material from another plant combined to form the seed. And then fusing gametes, so this is just maybe the vocabulary is a little hard here. Fusing means coming together, so when two objects become one, that's fusing. And then gametes means sex cells. Gametes are sex cells, so we'd have like a pollen and an egg cell, and they fuse together to become called a zygote, and then that develops into a seed. So fusing gametes is saying the same thing as a pollen and an egg cell combining. Both of these are gametes, and fusing means they come together. So budding is our example of asexual reproduction. Alright guys, I hope that helped, and good luck on the retake. Remember to write down the password.